Winter of 1412. Snow fell softly over the ancient stones of Ashworth Castle, each flake descending like a whispered prayer upon the frozen earth of northern England. The fortress had stood for 3 centuries upon that windswept hill, its towers piercing the gray December sky like fingers reaching toward heaven, its walls holding secrets that time itself had chosen to forget. Within those walls, torches flickered against tapestries depicting battles long since won and losses never fully mourned. The great hall stretched vast and cold beneath timber beams, blackened by generations of hearth smoke, and the servants who moved through its shadows did so with the practiced silence of those who understood that their existence depended upon remaining unseen. Among them walked a young woman named Eleanor Thorne, her wool dress the color of earth, her hands roughened by years of labor, her eyes holding depths that no servant's eyes should possess. She was 24 years of age, with hair the shade of autumn chestnuts bound beneath a simple linen coif, and a face that might have been called beautiful had anyone thought to look upon it with more than passing indifference. She carried a wooden trencher toward the kitchens, her footsteps silent against the rush-strewn floor, her gaze fixed upon the middle distance where servants learned to look. But her thoughts wandered far from the tasks that filled her days, traveling instead toward memories she had sworn to bury, toward a life that had been stolen from her before she had fully understood its worth. Eleanor Thorne had not always been a servant. Once, in another lifetime, she had worn silk against her skin and danced in halls illuminated by 100 candles. Once, she had been the daughter of a baron, promised to a future that gleamed with possibility. But fate, that cruel architect of human suffering, had stripped everything from her in a single night of fire and betrayal, leaving her with nothing but her life and the desperate need to remain hidden from those who would see even that taken from her. Now she existed in the shadows of Ashworth Castle, scrubbing floors and carrying trenchers, invisible to the lords and ladies who passed her without a glance. She had learned to find peace in anonymity, comfort in the rhythm of honest labor, and something almost resembling contentment in the knowledge that each day survived was a small victory against those who had destroyed her family. But winter had come to Ashworth Castle, and with it a presence that would shatter the fragile sanctuary she had constructed around her wounded heart. Lord Richard Ashworth, Duke of Northmere, had returned from the wars in France. The castle had been in upheaval for a fortnight before his arrival. Servants scrubbed floors that had not seen such attention in years. The cook labored over menus designed to welcome home a master who had been absent for nearly 3 winters. And throughout the household, attention hummed beneath every polished surface, every freshly laundered tapestry, every torch that burned brighter than necessity demanded. Eleanor felt that tension in her bones as she worked alongside the other servants, her hands raw from the cold water she used to scrub the great hall's flagstones. She had heard the whispered stories about Lord Richard, tales that painted him as both hero and enigma. They said he had distinguished himself at Agincourt, fighting beside King Henry himself. They said he had saved the lives of 12 men through courage that bordered upon recklessness. They said he returned now bearing wounds that the physicians could not heal, wounds of the spirit that manifested in silences so profound that even his closest companions dared not breach them. She had never seen him. He had departed for France before her arrival at the castle, leaving his estates in the capable hands of his steward, Master Aldrich, and his formidable mother, the Dowager Duchess Margaret. Eleanor had learned to navigate the household by understanding its hierarchies, by knowing which servants held power and which could be safely ignored, by making herself useful enough to be valued but invisible enough to be forgotten. The Duke's return threatened to upset every careful calculation she had made. It was late afternoon when the horns sounded from the watchtower, their notes carrying across the frozen landscape like a proclamation of destiny arriving. Eleanor was in the great hall, laying fresh rushes mixed with dried lavender and rosemary, when the massive oak doors swung open and cold air rushed inward like an invading army. She did not look up. Servants did not look upon their masters unless directly addressed. This was a truth she had learned in the first weeks of her service, a rule that had protected her from recognition by visiting nobles who might have known her father, might have remembered the girl she had once been. But something made her pause in her labor. Something in the quality of the silence that fell over the hall, in the way the very air seemed to hold its breath. and against every instinct that had kept her safe for 3 long years, Eleanor lifted her gaze. He stood in the doorway like a figure carved from shadow and winter light. Tall, broad-shouldered, with dark hair falling past his collar, and a face that bore the marks of battles both physical and spiritual. His riding cloak was dusted with snow, his boots caked with the mud of long roads traveled, and his eyes, when they swept across the hall, held a weariness so profound that Eleanor felt it echo in her own chest, like a wound reopened. Lord Richard Ashworth, Duke of Northmere, had the kind of presence that made the world around him seem smaller, less significant. He moved into the hall with the measured stride of a man accustomed to command, accepting the greetings of his steward and the household servants with nods that conveyed neither warmth nor coldness, merely acknowledgement of their existence. Eleanor lowered her gaze and returned to her work, her heart beating with uncomfortable speed against her ribs. She told herself it was merely surprise, merely the disruption of a routine she had come to depend upon. She told herself that his arrival meant nothing to her beyond the additional labor it would require, the extra vigilance necessary to avoid drawing attention from a master who now walked these halls. But even as she scattered the fragrant rushes across the floor, she could not shake the image of those eyes, gray as storm clouds, holding depths of sorrow that she recognized with terrible clarity. She knew that look. She had seen it in her own reflection during the darkest months after her family's destruction. It was the look of someone who had lost everything that mattered and could not understand why they continued to breathe. The household fell into the practiced chaos of welcoming its lord. Servants rushed to prepare his chambers, to draw hot water for his bath, to lay fires in rooms that had stood cold during his absence. Eleanor found herself assigned to assist in the kitchens, far from the main corridors where the Duke and his retinue moved, and she accepted the task with relief that bordered upon gratitude. Distance was safety. Invisibility was survival. These were the truths by which she lived. But fate, it seemed, had other plans for Eleanor Thorne. It was near midnight when she was summoned by Mrs. Holbrook, the head housekeeper, a woman whose stern demeanor concealed a fairness that Eleanor had come to appreciate during her years of service. "The Duke has requested warm wine in the library," Mrs. Holbrook said, her voice carrying the particular tension that accompanied any task involving the master directly. "Mary has taken ill, and the other girls are occupied with the guest chambers. You will serve him." Eleanor felt the blood drain from her face. Mrs. Holbrook, surely there is someone more suitable. I am not trained for direct service to his lordship." The housekeeper's eyes narrowed, not with suspicion, but with the impatience of a woman who had too many tasks and too few hands. "You are capable, you are presentable, and you are available. That is sufficient. The tray is prepared. You will knock, enter when bidden, serve the wine, and depart. It is not complicated." There was no arguing with Mrs. Holbrook when she used that tone. Eleanor accepted the tray with hands that trembled only slightly, grateful that the dim corridor concealed her distress. The library lay in the east wing of the castle, a room she had cleaned many times during the Duke's absence. It housed hundreds of books and manuscripts, treasures accumulated by generations of Ashworths who valued learning alongside military prowess. Eleanor had spent stolen moments there, running her fingers across leather spines, remembering a time when she had been permitted to read, when knowledge had been her birthright rather than a forbidden luxury. She paused outside the heavy wooden door, steadying her breath, composing her features into the blank expression that servants wore like armor. Then she knocked, a single firm rap against the ancient oak. "Enter." His voice was deeper than she had expected, roughened by cold air and perhaps by the silence of long campaigns. Eleanor pushed open the door and stepped into the library, her gaze fixed upon the floor as propriety demanded. The room was warm, heated by a fire that crackled in the massive stone hearth. Candles burned on the desk near the window, illuminating manuscripts and maps that spoke of a mind still engaged with the world, despite the weariness she had glimpsed earlier. And in a chair beside the fire, Lord Richard sat with a book open upon his knee, though his eyes were not upon its pages. They were upon her. Eleanor felt his gaze like a physical weight as she crossed the room, set the tray upon the small table beside his chair, and poured the steaming wine into the silver goblet with hands she willed not to shake. "Your wine, my lord," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. She turned to leave, desperate to escape the intensity of his attention, but his voice stopped her before she reached the door. "Wait." The word was not a command, not quite. There was something almost questioning in its tone, as if he himself was uncertain why he had spoken. Eleanor froze, her back to him, her heart hammering against her ribs. "Turn around." She obeyed, because servants obeyed, because 3 years of survival had taught her that resistance brought only suffering. She turned and faced him, keeping her eyes lowered, her posture that of perfect submission. For a long moment, he said nothing. She could hear the fire crackling, could hear the wind howling against the window glass, could hear her own breath loud in the silence. "Look at me." This command she could not obey. Looking at him meant risking recognition, meant gambling everything she had built upon the chance that he might see past her servant's garb to the woman beneath. She shook her head, a tiny motion that could be interpreted as shyness or deference. "Please, my lord, I have duties to attend." "Your duties can wait." His voice had hardened slightly, taking on the tone of a man unaccustomed to having his requests denied. "I asked you to look at me." Slowly, with the reluctance of one approaching execution, Eleanor raised her gaze. Their eyes met across the firelit room, and she watched something shift in his expression, a flicker of uncertainty that seemed foreign to his commanding features. "What is your name?" he asked. "Eleanor, my lord, Eleanor Thorne." He repeated the name as if testing its weight upon his tongue. "Eleanor, how long have you served in this household?" 3 years, my lord. Since the autumn of your departure for France." 3 years. He leaned back in his chair, his eyes never leaving her face. "And in 3 years I have never seen you. How is that possible in a household I have known since birth?" "I am a servant, my lord. We are not meant to be seen." Something that might have been amusement flickered across his features, gone so quickly she might have imagined it. "A servant who speaks with the diction of a noblewoman. A servant whose eyes hold knowledge beyond her station. You are a mystery, Eleanor Thorne." Fear coiled in her stomach like a living thing. "I am no mystery, my lord. I am simply a woman grateful for honest work and a roof over her head." He studied her for a moment longer, and she felt certain that he could see through her careful disguise, that he knew exactly what she was hiding. But when he spoke, his words surprised her. "You may go." She curtsied and fled, her composure crumbling the moment the library door closed behind her. She pressed her back against the cold stone wall of the corridor, her breath coming in shallow gasps, her heart refusing to slow its panicked rhythm. He had looked at her. He had seen something. And now, after 3 years of careful anonymity, Eleanor Thorne was no longer invisible. Check if you are already subscribed to this channel. If you value stories that touch the deepest corners of your heart, stories that remind you what it means to feel truly alive, then join this community of souls who still believe in the power of love and redemption. The days following Lord Richard's return settled into a rhythm that felt both familiar and strange. The castle hummed with the energy of a household reunited with its master, servants moving with renewed purpose, the very stones seeming to breathe more deeply now that the Duke walked their halls once more. Eleanor avoided the main corridors whenever possible. She volunteered for tasks in the kitchens, in the laundry, in the cold storage rooms where noble eyes never wandered. Mrs. Holbrook observed these choices with quiet curiosity, but said nothing, perhaps assuming that the young servant was simply nervous about serving so close to the master. If only it were that simple. But despite her efforts, Eleanor could not entirely escape Lord Richard's presence. The castle was vast but finite, and his restless energy seemed to carry him into every corner of his domain. She would be scrubbing the flagstones of a corridor and hear his footsteps approaching, forcing her to press herself against the wall and lower her gaze until he passed. She would be carrying linens through the great hall and glimpse him standing at one of the high windows, staring out at the frozen landscape with an expression of such profound isolation that her chest ached with unwanted empathy. She learned things about him in the way that servants always learned things, through overheard conversations and observations made from the shadows. She learned that he slept poorly, that the candles in his chambers burned until nearly dawn. She learned that he ate sparingly, picking at meals that the cook had labored over for hours. She learned that his mother, the Dowager Duchess, was deeply concerned about him, her usually imperious voice softening to pleading when she spoke of her son's health. And she learned, through whispered gossip that circulated through the servants' quarters like wildfire, that Lord Richard had lost someone during the war. Not in battle, but in spirit. A man who had been his closest friend, his brother in all but blood, had died in his arms at Agincourt, and the Duke had not been the same since. This knowledge settled into Eleanor's heart like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples through defenses she had thought impenetrable. She understood grief. She understood the way it could hollow you out, leaving a shell that walked and talked and performed the functions of living, while something essential remained forever absent. It was dangerous, this understanding. It made him human in ways she could not afford. It created connection where she needed only distance. A week after his return, Lord Richard called for a feast to honor the soldiers who had traveled with him from France. The great hall was transformed for the occasion, long tables laid with the finest linens the castle possessed, candles blazing from every sconce and chandelier, the scents of roasted meats and fresh bread filling the air with warmth against the winter cold outside. Eleanor was assigned to serve at one of the lower tables, far from the dais where the Duke sat with his knights and honored guests. She moved through her duties with practiced efficiency, filling cups and clearing trenchers, her eyes carefully averted from the head table where Lord Richard held court. But even from that distance she could not help noticing things, the way he listened to his companions with apparent attention while his thoughts clearly wandered elsewhere. The way his hand often moved to his left side, pressing against his ribs as if soothing a wound that had never fully healed. The way his mother watched him with barely concealed anxiety, her own food untouched upon her plate. The feast progressed through its courses, the hall growing louder as wine flowed freely, and the soldiers celebrated their homecoming with increasing enthusiasm. Eleanor had retreated to the kitchens to collect more bread when she encountered Mrs. Holbrook, whose face was drawn with worry. "His lordship's squire has taken ill," the housekeeper said without preamble. "Too much wine, the foolish boy. The Duke requires someone to attend him in the great hall. You will go." Eleanor opened her mouth to protest, to offer any excuse that might spare her from such direct exposure, but Mrs. Holbrook had already turned away, her attention claimed by a dozen other crises demanding resolution. With no other choice, Eleanor smoothed her dress, adjusted her coif, and made her way back to the great hall. The Duke's seat at the high table was elevated on a dais, giving him a clear view of the entire hall and its occupants. A chair beside him stood empty, the place where his squire would normally wait to attend to his lord's needs. Eleanor approached the dais with her heart in her throat, curtsying deeply before ascending the few steps that separated the high table from the rest of the hall. Lord Richard was engaged in conversation with one of his knights, a grizzled warrior whose scarred face spoke of decades of battle. He did not acknowledge her presence as she took her position behind his chair, and Eleanor allowed herself a moment of relief that perhaps she might pass this duty unnoticed. But as she stood there, close enough to catch the scent of wood smoke and leather that clung to his clothing, close enough to see the fine lines of exhaustion around his eyes, she realized that her relief was premature. He knew she was there. She could see it in the subtle tension of his shoulders, in the way his hand paused momentarily on his wine cup before lifting it to his lips. He knew, and he was choosing not to acknowledge her, and somehow that deliberate awareness was worse than direct attention would have been. The feast continued. Eleanor refilled his cup when it grew empty, removed his trencher when he had finished eating, performed every duty required of a serving attendant with flawless precision. And through it all, Lord Richard did not look at her once, though she felt his consciousness of her presence like heat from a fire held too close. It was nearly the hour of midnight when the feast began to wind down, soldiers and servants alike growing weary from the evening's revelry. The Dowager Duchess had retired an hour earlier, casting one final worried glance at her son, before allowing her ladies to escort her to her chambers. The knights who remained at the high table were deep in their cups, their conversation growing louder and less coherent as exhaustion battled with wine-fueled energy. Lord Richard rose from his chair abruptly, his movements silencing the conversations around him with the authority that his mere presence commanded. He spoke briefly to Master Aldrich, his steward, then turned and walked toward the small door at the back of the dais, the one that led to a private corridor connecting the great hall to the family's living quarters. He paused at the door and, without turning around, spoke a single word. Eleanor. Her name on his lips sent a shiver down her spine that had nothing to do with the winter cold. She glanced at the other servants nearby, hoping that one of them might volunteer to answer in her stead, but they avoided her gaze with the instinct of those who knew better than to insert themselves into matters involving the master. She followed him. The corridor was dark, lit only by occasional torches that cast dancing shadows upon the stone walls. Lord Richard walked ahead of her with long strides that forced her to nearly run to keep pace, leading her deeper into the private reaches of the castle until they reached a door she recognized as belonging to a small chamber used for private audiences. He opened the door and stepped inside, and Eleanor, having no choice but to comply, followed him into the room. A single candle burned on a table near the window, providing barely enough light to see. The chamber was simply furnished, containing only a few chairs, a table, and a tapestry depicting a hunting scene that had faded with centuries of exposure. Lord Richard moved to the window and stood there with his back to her, his silhouette dark against the frost-patterned glass. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Eleanor stood near the door, her hands clasped before her posture that of a servant awaiting instruction. But her heart beat with a rhythm that had nothing to do with servitude, a rhythm of fear and anticipation, and something else she dared not name. Finally, without turning around, Lord Richard spoke. 3 years ago, the night before I departed for France, there was a fire at Baron Thorn's estate. The entire family was believed to have perished. The Baron, his wife, his son, and his daughter. He paused, and she could hear him draw a slow breath. Eleanor. Her name again, but this time spoken as if it were a question, a conclusion, an accusation. She said nothing. There was nothing to say. He knew. Somehow, impossibly, he knew. I attended a feast at Thorn Manor when I was a young man, he continued, his voice quiet and measured. Baron Thorn's daughter was 15 years old then. She played the lute beautifully and argued with me about the merits of Chaucer versus French poetry. She had eyes like winter storms, and a laugh that made everyone in the room want to hear it again. He turned then, and in the candlelight, his face was unreadable. She had a small scar on her left wrist from a childhood accident with a needlework scissors. She was proud of it, she said, because it reminded her that even pain could become a story worth telling. Eleanor's hand moved instinctively to her left wrist, where beneath the fabric of her sleeve, a thin white scar traced a line across her skin. You remember, she whispered. I remember everything about that night. He took a step toward her, then stopped, as if uncertain of his right to approach. I remember thinking that Baron Thorn's daughter would grow into a woman of remarkable spirit. I remember being disappointed when I learned that my family had no connection to hers that might justify a marriage proposal. And I remember, 3 years ago, feeling something I did not expect to feel when word came of the fire. Grief? The word escaped her before she could stop it, carrying all the bitterness of someone who had watched her world burn, while strangers expressed sorrow they did not truly feel. Anger, he corrected softly. Anger at whoever had done this thing. Anger at a world that would allow such destruction of innocent lives, and anger at myself, for never having found the courage to speak to your father about the possibility of a match between our families. The admission struck her like a blow. She stared at him, her careful composure fracturing around the edges, revealing glimpses of the woman she had buried beneath layers of survival instinct. Why are you telling me this? She asked. If you know who I am, if you know that I have been living a lie in your household for 3 years, why have you not called for your guards? Why have you not demanded an explanation? Because I want to understand. He moved closer, close enough that she could see the emotions warring in his gray eyes, close enough that the scent of him filled her senses and made clear thought nearly impossible. I want to understand how the daughter of Baron Thorn came to be scrubbing floors in my castle. I want to understand what happened to your family, who destroyed them and why. And I want to understand why you chose to hide rather than seek justice. A sound escaped her then, something between a laugh and a sob. Justice? You speak of justice as if it were something available to a woman with no family, no resources, no proof of anything except memories that would be dismissed as the ravings of a grief-stricken mind? Tell me, he said simply. Tell me what happened, and I will decide what justice might be possible. Eleanor closed her eyes, feeling the weight of 3 years of silence pressing against her chest. She had told no one. She had buried the truth so deeply that sometimes she herself forgot the details, forgot the faces of those who had betrayed her family, forgot everything except the imperative to survive. But standing here in this dark chamber with a man who had remembered a scar on a 15-year-old girl's wrist, she felt that burial beginning to shift. The truth rose within her like water seeking the surface, demanding release after years of suppression. My uncle, she whispered. My father's brother, Geoffrey. He coveted our lands, our wealth, our position. My father trusted him, named him guardian in his will should anything happen to my parents before I was married. Geoffrey arranged the fire. He hired men to set it while we slept, to make it look like an accident that claimed us all. But you escaped. My brother woke me. Thomas, he... Her voice broke on her brother's name, that wound still raw despite the passage of years. He smelled the smoke before the flames reached our chambers. He got me out through a servant's passage, told me to run and not look back. I did. I ran until I could run no more, and when I finally stopped, I realized that I was alone. Thomas never emerged from the flames. Lord Richard's hand rose, hesitated, then settled gently upon her shoulder. The contact sent warmth spreading through her chilled body, a warmth that had nothing to do with temperature and everything to do with the simple human comfort of touch after years of isolation. Your uncle believes you dead, he said. It was not a question. He believes what he needs to believe, what the world believes. Eleanor Thorne died in that fire with her family. The woman who stands before you is a ghost wearing a servant's dress, a remnant of something that should not exist. But you do exist. His hand tightened slightly on her shoulder. You are real and alive, and you have been living in my household under my protection without my even knowing it. That ends now. Fear spiked through her, sharp and immediate. My lord, please. If you expose me, if word reaches my uncle that I survived, I have no intention of exposing you. His voice had hardened, taking on the authority of a man accustomed to command. I have every intention of protecting you. And when the time is right, when we have gathered enough evidence to prove your uncle's crimes, I have every intention of seeing justice done. Eleanor stared at him, unable to reconcile his words with anything her experience had taught her to expect. Why? She asked. Why would you involve yourself in this? I am nothing to you. My family's troubles are not your concern. Lord Richard released her shoulder and stepped back, putting distance between them that she felt as keenly as cold air rushing into a warm room. Because I have spent 3 years watching good men die for causes that had nothing to do with justice or honor, he said quietly. I have returned from war with nothing to show for it except nightmares and a conviction that the world is fundamentally broken. And now, standing before me, I find a woman who has survived horrors I can only imagine, who has rebuilt her life from ashes through nothing but determination and courage. You ask why I would involve myself? He met her eyes, and in his gaze she saw something that looked almost like reverence. Because protecting you, helping you reclaim what was stolen, might be the first worthy thing I have done in longer than I can remember. The days that followed that midnight conversation transformed Eleanor's existence within Ashworth Castle in ways both subtle and profound. Outwardly, nothing changed. She continued to perform her duties, to move through the corridors with downcast eyes, to blend into the background as she had trained herself to do. But beneath that surface of normalcy, everything had shifted. Lord Richard had assigned her to new duties, ostensibly at the request of his mother, who claimed to need an additional maid for her personal chambers. The reassignment raised eyebrows among the other servants, particularly because Eleanor had no training in the delicate work of attending a noblewoman. But the Dowager Duchess Margaret, brought into confidence about Eleanor's true identity, had accepted the arrangement with surprising grace. She was a formidable woman, Margaret Ashworth, with silver hair swept beneath an elaborate headdress and eyes that missed nothing that occurred within her domain. On the morning Eleanor first presented herself at the Duchess's chambers, the older woman had studied her with frank assessment before nodding once. "You have the bearing," she had said simply. "3 years in service have not erased it entirely. We shall have to be careful, but it can be managed." "I am grateful for your discretion, my lady," Eleanor had replied, her voice steady despite her nervousness. The Duchess had waved a hand dismissively. "My son has explained the situation. Your uncle is a creature I have long despised, though I could never quite articulate why. Now I understand. There is something fundamentally corrupted in a man who would murder his own brother for wealth." She had paused, her gaze sharpening. "You will attend me publicly, but privately you will have access to certain resources that might assist in building a case against Lord Geoffrey. My late husband kept extensive correspondence, some of which may prove useful. Can you read?" "Yes, my lady. My father saw to my education." "Good. Then you will spend your evenings in my private library, searching for anything that might connect Geoffrey Thorne to his crimes. My son will provide military intelligence. I will provide social. Between us, we may yet see justice done." And so Eleanor's double life became a triple existence. By day, she performed the duties of a lady's maid, brushing the Duchess's hair and mending her delicate garments and accompanying her to chapel. By evening, she searched through decades of correspondence, looking for any mention of Geoffrey Thorne's debts, his ambitions, his connections to men who might have helped him orchestrate her family's murder. And in the stolen moments between, she found herself drawn into Lord Richard's orbit in ways that troubled her increasingly careful heart. He sought her out. That was the simple truth of it. He found reasons to visit his mother's chambers when Eleanor was present. He appeared in the private library during her evening research, offering assistance in deciphering his father's cramped handwriting. He walked with her through the castle's frozen gardens when the Duchess required fresh air, keeping a careful distance that somehow felt more intimate than closeness would have been. They spoke of many things during those walks. He told her of the war, of the horror of Agincourt and the friends he had lost there. She told him of her childhood, of her father's gentle wisdom and her mother's fierce protectiveness. They discovered shared interests in poetry and philosophy, debating the merits of various authors with an ease that felt both natural and dangerous. Dangerous because Eleanor was beginning to feel things she could not afford to feel. Dangerous because every conversation drew her closer to a man who existed in a world she could no longer claim to inhabit. She was a servant. He was a duke. The gulf between them was vast as the winter sky, and no amount of shared suffering could truly bridge it. Or so she told herself, in the quiet hours of the night when sleep refused to come. It was during the 3rd week of this new arrangement that something happened to shift the delicate balance they had maintained. The Dowager Duchess had taken ill with a winter fever, nothing serious but enough to confine her to bed and restrict visitors to her chambers. Eleanor tended her with gentle efficiency, bringing broths and herbal remedies, ensuring the fire burned steadily, sitting by her bedside during the long hours when sleep came in troubled fragments. Lord Richard visited daily, his face drawn with worry that spoke of more than filial duty. Eleanor observed him during these visits, noting the way his eyes lingered upon her even as he spoke to his mother, noting the tension in his shoulders that seemed to ease slightly when she entered the room. One evening, when the Duchess had finally fallen into peaceful sleep, Lord Richard gestured for Eleanor to follow him into the adjoining sitting room. The fire had burned low, casting long shadows across the tapestried walls, and the intimacy of the setting made Eleanor's pulse quicken with awareness. "She will recover," Eleanor said softly, anticipating his concern. "The fever has broken. She needs only rest now." "I know." He stood by the window, his profile sharp against the frost-covered glass. "That is not why I asked you here." He turned to face her, and in the firelight, she saw something in his expression that made her breath catch. "My men have found evidence," he said. "A letter from your uncle to a man named Roderick Marsh, a mercenary known for taking difficult commissions." The letter references a payment for services rendered at an estate in the northern counties, dated 3 days after the fire that destroyed your family. Eleanor's knees weakened. She reached for the back of a chair to steady herself. You have proof. I have the beginning of proof. Enough to bring before the king's justice if we proceed carefully. He crossed the room toward her, stopping close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his body. But there is something else I must tell you, Eleanor. Something that cannot wait any longer. My lord, Richard. His voice was rough with emotion. When we are alone, I would have you call me Richard. She shook her head, even as her heart cried out to accept what he was offering. That would not be proper. You are the daughter of Baron Thorn, he interrupted. You are a woman of noble birth who has suffered unimaginable loss and survived through courage that humbles me. You are not a servant, Eleanor, you never were. But I have lived as one. For 3 years I have scrubbed floors and emptied chamber pots and lowered my eyes before people who once would have curtsied to me. That changes a person, Richard. She used his name deliberately, tasting it on her tongue like something forbidden and sweet. I am not the girl you remember from that feast. I am not the woman I might have become if that fire had never happened. No, he agreed softly. You are more. You are stronger, wiser, more resilient than anyone I have ever known. And he paused, as if gathering courage for what came next. I find that I cannot imagine my life without you in it. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. Eleanor felt tears burning behind her eyes, tears she had not allowed herself to shed in 3 long years. You are a duke, she whispered. You will be expected to marry someone of great family, someone who can bring alliance and wealth to your house. I have nothing to offer you except a name stained by tragedy and a claim to lands that may never be recovered. Richard reached out and took her hands in his grip warm and steady and sure. You offer me something no alliance could provide, he said. You offer me hope. You offer me a reason to believe that this world, for all its cruelty, still contains beauty worth fighting for. If these words touched something deep within your soul, if you feel the truth of love that transcends all obstacles, leave a comment saying, "Love finds a way." Let me know that you believe in the power of hearts destined to meet. Spring arrived slowly in the northern counties, winter releasing its grip with reluctance, snow melting into streams that swelled with the promise of renewal. And with spring came the day that Eleanor had both longed for and dreaded since that midnight conversation in the Duke's private chamber. Lord Geoffrey Thorn had been summoned to answer charges before the king's justice. The evidence Lord Richard had gathered was damning. The letter to Roderick Marsh was only the beginning. Through careful investigation, they had uncovered witnesses, servants who had fled Geoffrey's employ and were willing to testify to his cruelty, merchants who had been cheated by his dealings, and most crucially, a confession from Marsh himself, who had been captured attempting to flee to France and had chosen to betray his employer rather than face execution alone. Eleanor stood in the great hall of Ashworth Castle as the proceedings unfolded, no longer dressed in servant's wool, but in a gown of deep blue velvet that the Dowager Duchess had insisted upon. Her hair was unbound from its linen coif, falling in waves past her shoulders, and around her neck hung a pendant that had belonged to her mother, recovered from Geoffrey's own collection of stolen treasures. She looked, for the first time in 3 years, like the woman she had been born to be. Geoffrey's face when he saw her was something she would remember until her dying day. The color drained from his features, leaving him pale as the winter snow that had finally melted from the castle grounds. His mouth opened and closed without sound, like a fish drowning in air. "Eleanor," he finally managed, "this is impossible. You died. You died in the fire." "I survived," she said, her voice steady despite the trembling in her hands. "I survived because my brother saved me, because Thomas gave his life so that I might live to see this day. You took everything from me, Uncle. My father, my mother, my brother, my home. But you could not take my life, and you cannot escape the justice that has finally found you." The trial was brief. The evidence was overwhelming. Geoffrey Thorn was found guilty of murder, arson, and theft of noble inheritance. His sentence was death, to be carried out at the king's pleasure. As he was led away in chains, Geoffrey turned one final time to look at his niece. There was no remorse in his eyes, only bitter hatred and the impotent rage of a man who had gambled everything and lost. "You should have died with them," he spat. "You should have burned." Eleanor met his gaze without flinching. "Perhaps," she said quietly, "but I didn't. And now, uncle, it is you who will face the flames of judgment, whether in this world or the next." The doors closed behind him, and Eleanor felt something release in her chest, a tension she had carried for so long that she had forgotten what it felt like to breathe without its weight. It was over. After 3 years of hiding, of fear, of grief held in check by the necessity of survival, it was finally over. She became aware of a presence beside her and turned to find Richard standing there, his expression a mixture of pride and something deeper, something that made her heart beat faster despite the solemnity of the moment. "It is done," he said simply. "Yes." She drew a shaky breath. "I thought I would feel more. Joy, perhaps, or satisfaction. But I feel only empty, as if I have been carrying a burden for so long that I do not know who I am without it." Richard took her hand, right there in the great hall before the assembled witnesses, before his mother and his knights and the servants who had once been her fellow laborers in anonymity. "Then let me help you discover who you might become," he said. "Let me spend the rest of my days learning the woman you are, not the tragedy you survived." Summer came to Ashworth Castle like a benediction, warm winds carrying the scent of wildflowers across the moors, sunlight streaming through windows that had known too much darkness during the winter months. The castle itself seemed to breathe more easily, as if it too had been waiting for the resolution that had finally come. Eleanor's inheritance had been restored. Thorn Manor, though damaged by the fire, was being rebuilt under the supervision of craftsmen her father would have approved. The lands, the wealth, the position that Geoffrey had stolen were hers once more, though she found that she cared far less about such things than she had expected to. What she cared about stood beside her in the castle's chapel, dressed in formal attire that could not quite conceal the warrior beneath, speaking vows that would bind their lives together for whatever years God chose to grant them. "I, Richard, take thee, Eleanor, to be my wedded wife, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, till death us do part." His voice was steady, but she could see the emotion burning in his gray eyes, an emotion that matched the warmth spreading through her own chest as she spoke her own vows in return. The Dowager Duchess wept openly, claiming that it was merely the dust in the ancient chapel affecting her eyes. The servants who had once been Eleanor's companions watched with expressions of wonder, still adjusting to the transformation of the quiet maid they had known into the duchess she had become. And outside the chapel walls, the people of the surrounding villages celebrated with feasting and dancing that would continue well into the night. But for Eleanor, the true celebration was far simpler than all of that. It was the feeling of Richard's hand clasping hers as they were pronounced man and wife. It was the tender press of his lips against her forehead as he sealed their union with a kiss that promised everything and demanded nothing. It was the knowledge that after years of running, of hiding, of being invisible, she had finally found a place where she was not only seen but cherished. That evening, as the last light of the summer sun painted the sky in shades of gold and rose, Eleanor stood at the window of the chamber she now shared with her husband. Richard came to stand behind her, his arms wrapping around her waist, his chin resting upon her shoulder, as they watched the day surrender to gentle twilight. "What are you thinking?" he asked softly. She leaned back against his chest, drawing comfort from his solid warmth. "I am thinking about how strange fate can be. If my uncle had not destroyed my family, I would never have come to this castle. I would never have met you. Never have known this love that feels as if it was always waiting for me, just beyond the horizon of my understanding. Do you regret it?" His voice carried a note of vulnerability that still surprised her, this evidence that even a man as powerful as the Duke of Northmere could harbor doubts. "The path that brought you here with all its pain and loss?" Eleanor turned in his arms to face him, reaching up to cup his face in her hands. I regret every moment of suffering, she said honestly. I regret the loss of my parents, my brother, the life I might have lived. But I cannot regret the destination, Richard. I cannot regret finding you. He kissed her then, deeply and thoroughly, with all the passion that their careful courtship had held in check. And when they finally drew apart, both breathless and flushed, Eleanor saw in his eyes the same wonder that she felt blooming in her own heart. They had both been broken by the world's cruelty. They had both carried wounds that seemed too deep to ever fully heal. But together, they were discovering that broken things could be made whole again, not by forgetting the cracks, but by filling them with gold. Autumn returned to Ashworth Castle, painting the moors in shades of amber and rust, filling the air with the crisp promise of change. But this autumn was different from the one that had brought Lord Richard home from the wars. This autumn carried with it the sound of a child's laughter echoing through ancient corridors. William Richard Ashworth, heir to the Duchy of Northmere, was 3 months old when the leaves began to fall. He had his father's dark hair and his mother's storm-gray eyes, and a disposition that alternated between fierce demands for attention and peaceful contentment that made everyone who held him fall instantly in love. Eleanor sat in the garden with her son in her arms, watching the leaves spiral down around them like nature's confetti. The Dowager Duchess sat nearby, ostensibly reading but actually watching her grandson with an expression of besotted devotion that would have shocked anyone who knew only her formidable public persona. Richard emerged from the castle and crossed the garden toward them, his stride easy with a contentment that had replaced the haunted tension he had carried when Eleanor first saw him. He bent to kiss his wife's forehead, then reached down to let his son grasp his finger with surprisingly strong grip. "A letter has arrived," he said, his voice casual, but his eyes bright with suppressed excitement. "From Thorn Manor, the reconstruction is complete." Eleanor's breath caught. The manor had been a symbol for so long of everything she had lost and everything she had hoped to reclaim. But now, looking at the family gathered around her, she realized that symbols had lost their power over her heart. "Will you wish to visit?" Richard asked. "To see it restored?" She considered the question carefully. The manor held memories, both beautiful and terrible. Walking its halls would mean confronting the ghosts of her past, remembering the family she had lost on the same ground, where she might now raise the family she had found. "Yes," she said finally. "But not yet. Not until William is old enough to understand why the visit matters. I want him to know where his mother came from, to understand that the stones of that house witnessed both tragedy and survival. But for now," she looked around the garden, at the castle that had become her home, at the man who had become her heart, at the child who represented everything she had never dared to hope for. "For now, I am exactly where I need to be." Richard sat down beside her on the stone bench, close enough that their shoulders touched, close enough that she could feel the steady rhythm of his breathing. His mother tactfully gathered her things and withdrew, leaving them alone with their son and the golden afternoon light. "I never thanked you properly," Eleanor said softly, "for that night in the great hall when you allowed me to sit beside you. The entire hall held its breath, watching a duke treat a servant as an equal. You risked your reputation, your standing, everything, for a woman you barely knew." Richard shook his head. "I knew you," he said. "Perhaps not the details of your story, but I knew the essence of who you were. I saw it in your eyes that first night in the library when you refused to look at me because you were afraid of what I might see. I saw courage and dignity and a spirit that refused to be broken no matter what the world had done to try." He took her hand, threading his fingers through hers. "You ask why I allowed you to sit beside me. The truth is simpler than you imagine. I allowed it because there was no other place you belonged." William chose that moment to make a sound of complaint, his small face scrunching with infant displeasure at being ignored. Eleanor laughed, the sound bright and free in the autumn air, and lifted her son to her shoulder, soothing him with gentle murmurs. She thought of the journey that had brought her here, from the flames of destruction to the warmth of this moment. She thought of her parents, her brother, all the loved ones who had been stolen from her. She thought of the years of hiding, of fear, of grief held in silence. And she thought of how all of it, every moment of suffering and every moment of joy, had led her to exactly this place, this time, this love that had grown from the ashes of everything she had lost. The hall had held its breath when the Duke allowed a humble servant to sit beside him, but Eleanor knew now that the true miracle was not that single moment of defiance against social order. The true miracle was everything that came after, the slow building of trust and understanding, the careful tending of wounds both visible and hidden, the gradual discovery that two broken souls could create something whole and beautiful together. She leaned against her husband's shoulder, their son cradled between them, and watched the autumn leaves fall like promises around them. Some stories end with kingdoms won and battles conquered, but the best stories, Eleanor had learned, end with something far simpler and far more precious. They end with coming home.